Hello and welcome. So today we are going to be looking at some Scottish cannibals. Christy Cleek, real name Andrew Christie, was a butcher from Perth and lived in the 14th century. During a famine in the mid-1300s, Christie joined up with a group of scavengers who worked in the foothills of the Grampians mountain range. A member of the scavengers died, so Christie used the skills he had learned butchering to cut up the corpse so the men could eat. The scavengers found out that they liked the taste of human flesh, so with Christie as their leader, they started to ambush travellers who passed by the Grampians, eating the poor travellers and their horses. Christie apparently killed 30 of the travellers himself. He would attack his victims by hooking them in the mouth with a hook on a pole, which was known as a cleek. The scavengers were eventually stopped by an armed force from Perth. We don't really know what happened to Christie after this, though his story does pop up in Chevreul's Proverbs written in 1896. They resorted to cannibalism at the instigation of their leader Andrew Christie, a Perth butcher. This monster lay in wait for passing horsemen and dragged them from the saddle with a large iron hook fixed to a long pole, hence his nickname. It is said that Christy Cleek died many years after, a married man and prosperous merchant in Dumfries. For centuries, the mere mention of the word Christy Cleek was sufficient to silence the noisiest child. A more famous Scottish cannibal is Sawney Bean, real name Alexander Bean. He lived in the 16th century and was born in East Lothian. His father was a ditch digger and a hedge trimmer. Bean entered the family trade but found that he didn't enjoy it, so he left his home with a woman called Black Agnes Douglas, who was said to be a witch. Together they would rob people, cannibalising one of their victims. Eventually Bean and Agnes set up home in a coastal cave in Benane Head. They lived in the cave undetected for 25 years, having 6 daughters and 8 sons. Because of their secluded lives, their children engaged in incest, having between them 14 granddaughters and 18 grandsons. The family worked together, laying traps to rob and kill travellers on the road. They took the bodies back to their cave where they would be dismembered and eaten. Discarded leftovers would wash up on nearby beaches, which led locals to believe that an animal was attacking travellers. But soon people began to notice that people were disappearing. Search parties were organised to look for the missing travellers, but no one could find him. Suspicion fell on local innkeepers because they were often the last person to see the travellers alive. Several innocent people were hanged for the disappearances. The Bean family carried on blissfully murdering and eating people until they came across a married couple. The husband happened to be an expert swordsman, having been trained in combat, and managed to hold the Beans off. But they still managed to grab the wife and take her away. The husband was left with the remaining Bean family, but luckily a large group of people happened upon them and the Bean family fled. The husband went to see the local magistrate to report what had happened. People now knew of the existence of the Bean family, and King James VI of Scotland led 400 men and a pack of bloodhounds to hunt the family down. The bloodhounds led the men to the Beans' cave, and when they entered the cave, the search party found the Bean family surrounded by body parts hanging off the walls, barrels filled with limbs, and lots of stolen jewellery. The Bean clan gave up without a fight and were taken to Tolbooth Gaol in Edinburgh. They were then taken to Leith or Glasgow, where they were executed without trial, being considered unfit for trial. Their deaths were rather gruesome. Sawney Bean and the other men of the family had their genitalia cut off and thrown into a fire. They then had their hands and feet cut off and left to bleed to death. Apparently, Sawney Bean's last words were, "It isn't over, it will never be over." Agnes and the women of the family were then tied to a stake and burned to death. There is another version of what happened. This one is not as gruesome. When the family were found, the search party set off dynamite at the entrance of the cave, trapping the family inside, where they slowly suffocated to death. Another story concerns one of the Beans family's daughter. One of the daughters left the family and settled in the nearby village of Girvan. After her family's discovery and execution, the daughter's identity was revealed and the villagers hanged her. So people today actually debate whether Christy Cleek and Sawney Bean were actual real people. Looking into it, it does seem like that most people feel that Christy Cleek was a real person, and he did operate at a time when there was a famine happening in Scotland, and there is evidence of this famine happening. But that time has turned Christy into some sort of folklore character, more like a bogeyman type of character. But many people feel that Sawney Bean might not have been a real person. Sean Thomas, in a 2005 article, notes that pamphlets and diaries around the time that Sawney Bean was supposed to be active do not mention him or mass disappearances of people at all. That's not to say there definitely wasn't a person as Sawney Bean. There could have been, but there might have been a load of embellishments onto his story. Or it even could have been that Sawney Bean's story has been built on the earlier story of Christy Cleek. Now, there is actually another cannibal story from Scotland that is a little bit more like Sawney Bean's story than what Christy Cleek's story is. This story appeared in a work by Nathaniel Crouch in 1696. It takes place in 1495 during the reign of King James II of Scotland. The story goes that a thief and his family lived in a den, and they would kill and eat young people. When the family was caught, they were all burned alive. So Sawney Bean's story doesn't actually appear in print until about 150 years ago in the 19th century. It first appears in chapbooks, and chapbooks are cheap publications that concentrate on crimes, sensational tales and scandals about the nobility. So was Sawney Bean a real person, or was his story just made up for entertainment? I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.